And our next speaker is Runjing Lu, who is with us already.
Hi.
Hi. And we are not seeing your screen at the minute, Runjing.
I'm going to share my screen now.
Okay.
Would you be able to see it?
Yes, now we can see it.
Great.
And she will be talking further about creating a sense of community, our response to COVID-19 and the society's response to COVID-19, and in particular about the racial disparities, as far as I can tell from your title as well. So we're looking very much forward to it.
Yeah, so I would first like to thank you very much for organizing this wonderful conferences to help us better understand what the consequences of this COVID-19 pandemic have had on our society. So today I'm going to talk about a recent project joined with my co-author Yan Yingsheng to understand how the COVID-19 pandemic has sparked racial animus in the context of the United States. So racial animus can affect welfare in measurable ways, as economists have pointed out since the seminal work of Becker 1957. And there is more recent work that provides a growing body of evidence to support a claim that social animus has consequences on a society. So for example, the well-documented racial wage gap between Blacks and whites, even after controlling for their human capital, education, and work experience, as well as the residential racial segregation between communities with more minorities and less minorities, and the resulting persistent difference in the economic and population growth between these communities. So given these consequences of racial animus on the society, it's important to understand how this racial animus forms and spreads, so that we can come up with ideas to better cope with them, to reduce its damage to society, and maybe to prevent racial animus from further fueling the society. But to do this, it's not an easy task. And one reason is because racial animus is usually formed in a long period of time, and there's not one single event or factor that contributed to this racial animus. However, the COVID-19 pandemic, despite it being a very unfortunate event, it provides us with a natural experiment, which allows us to observe how racial animus can start and spread in a very short period of time. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the racial animus against the Asian population in the United States. So we know that the COVID-19 virus could possibly originate from Wuhan, China. But even in that case, the CDC and WHO have repeatedly emphasized that the Asian population are at no higher risk of spreading the virus than other populations. But despite this repeated emphasis, we still see an increasing number of hate incidents against the Asians since the outbreak of the pandemic. So here are just few examples that I've taken, which were reported by major news outlets in the US. For example, Asians heard this really bad racial slur yelled at them in front of their house. And also Asians faced racism while they were riding on subway and doing their everyday task. So these are all telltale signs that the racial animus against Asian population has increased in the wake of the pandemic. So the goal of this paper is to first understand, is it indeed the case that the COVID-19 pandemic has sparked racial animus in the US, or is it some other confounding factors that have driven this racial animus? And if it's indeed the case that COVID-19 pandemic has sparked racial animus, what are the factors that mediating this rise of racial animus? Why would people respond to COVID-19 pandemic in the form of racial animus? So in order to rigorously answer these questions, we need two things. So the first, as a researcher, we need to measure racial animus in real time. Otherwise, we won't be able to see how it changes before and after the outbreak of COVID-19. And the second thing we need to answer these questions is that we need to have an identification strategy that could help us separate the effects of the pandemic from other confounding factors. So now let me dig into these two elements a little bit. So first, our measurement of racial animus. Usually, as economists or sociologists, we measure racial animus, use data from hate crimes. For example, those from FBI Uniform Crime Reporting System, or we could use national surveys, which ask respondents about their general racial attitudes. For example, the general social survey data. But the problem with these measures right now is that we won't be able to have them until 2 years from now. So as an alternative, we go for this real-time proxy, which is based on Google searches and Twitter posts, which include the really bad racial slur against Asians, which is the C word. I will refer to it as the C word in the following presentation. So these real-time measures of racial animus have been used in past studies to measure racial attitudes against African Americans in the US. The idea behind this real-time proxy is that when there is higher racial animus in an area, individuals in that area will tend to use this slur more often. For example, search them or post them on social media more often. So then we will see when there is a general change in racial animus, we expect to see these measures based on these two Google searches and Twitter posts to change too. And a cool thing to use both Google and Twitter data together is that for Google searches, we know that it's usually done in private and it's subject to very low social censoring. So it could capture the private demonstration of racial animus. On the other hand, Twitter is a social media platform. So it can help us capture the tendency of individuals to publicly display racial animus. So we can capture racial animus from two aspects. So here is the actual way that we construct this racial animus. So basically, for each geographic location in each week, between November 2019 and April 2020, we can construct the following two measures of racial animus. So the first one is based on the Google searches of the racist slur. So the way to understand this proxy is that it's just basically a weekly percentage of racist searches, including the C word, over all searches in an area. So basically, this is the numerator. It's a fraction of searches that included this racial slur. We are going to scale it by the highest weekly percentage of racist searches in the same area during the whole time period. The reason that we opt for this measurement is because this data, so this measurement is directly provided by Google, and there's no way to descale it or to take out the denominator. So that's the best we can do with the Google data. So in terms of the second measurement, which is based on Twitter posts, we can understand this measurement as the weekly number of racist tweets per 100,000 tweets that including the in an area. And basically the 100,000 tweets including the in an area, we use it as a way to control for the total Twitter activity in the area. The reason we use the as the keyword is because it is the most frequently used or used words in tweets. So we can use that to proxy the general Twitter activity in an area. So these two measurements, so for Google data, it will be measured at the media market level, which is just a cluster of counties. And for Twitter data, we are going to measure it at the county level. So just to further validate that the measurements that we just construct can indeed capture the racial animus, we correlate these searches and tweets of C-word with the usual measurements for racial animus, such as hate crimes and restaurant visits to Chinese restaurants. So in the first two columns here, it basically tells you that in the historic data in 2014 and 2018, when there is higher C-word searches on Google, we see higher anti-Asian hate crimes in the same geographical locations in that month. Well, in columns 3 and 4, it basically tells you that when there is higher searches for this racial slur on Google, we see lower visits to Chinese restaurants between 2018 and 2019. So these results suggest that the measurements that we just construct seem to capture the racial animus, at least to some extent. Now, let me briefly talk about the second piece of identifying the effect of the COVID-19 on local animus. As I mentioned before, we need an identification strategy that can help us separate out the effects of COVID-19 from all the other confounding factors, right? Because there are so many things just happening at the same time. Well, the way we do it is by exploiting the plausibly exogenous timing of the first COVID-19 case in a local area. So as a shock to racial animus. So the idea of this is that the first COVID-19 confirmed case in an area represents a very salient increase in the infection risk and also the fear of this virus. And it's a very salient realization of the pandemic in front of your eyes. And in addition, this timing of the first case is plausibly exogenous, in the sense that it's really hard to imagine that the exact timing of the first case, whether it's this week or next week, is actually correlated with any other variables that's happening, that's changing at the same time that will also change the racial animus. So if you buy our identification strategy, then we could basically exploit this variation and conduct a difference in differences study to understand the effects of COVID-19 on the local racial animus. So basically, we are gonna regress our left-hand side, which is the racial animus measurement, on a series of dummies, which are just an indicators for which week you are relative to the first week of the COVID-19 confirmed case in your local area. Either it's from 6 weeks before all the way to 6 weeks after. And the coefficients of interest would be this beta K, which represent the effects of first COVID-19 cases on racial animus in this geographic location in the 8th week after the first case. But as you may wonder, there could be other things going on in the local area. So we will additionally control for local area specific variables that are changing across time. We are also control for the area fixed effects to capture for the average racial animus this area has all the ways in the past. And we are also going to control for a year-month fixed effects to control for the general trend of racial animus across the United States. Okay, now let's talk about our main findings. Here is the main finding. So basically, on these two panels, we plot the coefficients on this beta from the previous regression. So let's focus on the left panel first. So on the y-axis, is the scale of this beta coefficient, and the outcome is the racist search, the propensity to search for this racial slur, the C word, on Google. And on the x-axis is the number of weeks from the first confirmed COVID case in the local area, which is the red dashed line. As we can see, there's basically nothing going on. The lines are very flat in the weeks leading up to the first COVID case in the local area. But right after that, in the week right after that, we see a significant jump in the local area's propensity to search for this racial slur on Google, and it persists to 6 weeks afterward. this jump in the Google searches for this racist slur, it's about 20. And when we compare to the baseline mean of the Google searches on the same word, it amounts to about 66 percentage point increase in people's tendency to search for this racial slur on Google, right after they experience the first COVID case in their local area. And on the right panel, we switched our outcome variable to racially charged Twitter posts, which include the racial slur, the C word. And similarly to what we see for the Google data, the lines are very flat in the weeks leading up to the COVID-19 diagnosis. So basically, people are not posting this racial slur on Twitter differentially before the first case, but right after the first case, there is a large jump in people's tendency to post the C word on Twitter. And this jump in tendency is about one racial tweet per 100,000 tweets. And when we compare it to the baseline mean, which is just 0.8, this represents a 120% increase in people's tendency to post the racial slur on Twitter publicly. So these results taken together suggest that there is indeed a rise in racial animus in response to the first COVID-19 diagnosis in the local area. So we've conducted a bunch of robustness checks just to make sure that the effects that we found are actually there. So the first robustness we do is to run a placebo test, because you might be worried that the effects that we see just now might be due to some seasonal pattern. Maybe in some area, during this period of time, they are just usually the people are just more likely to use this racial slur. It doesn't mean that they changed their racism because of the COVID-19. Maybe it's just seasonality pattern in the racial animus in the United States. So in response to that, we conduct a placebo test, which we can construct a fake diagnosis date. So basically, we change, so we know the actual first case date in 2020 right now, and we can just replace the 2020 with the year 2019 and see how racial animus in the same local area change around that fake diagnosis date back in 2019. And here are what we found. So basically, there is nothing much going on in racial animus, either using the Google measurement or Twitter measurement. So people are not changing their racial animus in 2019 around the same time of the year. So it seems like seasonality could not explain our findings. And we've also done a bunch of other robustness checks, but for the sake of the time, I'm gonna skip those robustness checks. Okay, so one question is, who contributes to the rise in racial animus? Is it that a few existing racists who basically they already existing racists who just increase their tendency to search or post this racist tweets more often after the COVID-19 first case, or is it driven by users who have not used this racial slur before, but because of COVID-19, they start to harboring this racial animus? So with the unique Twitter user ID, we are able to answer this question. So basically, we can split the tweets contributed by Twitter users who never used this tweets before, which is the blue line, versus the racial tweets contributed from Twitter users who have used this racial slur before. And as we can see, the increase in racist tweets after the first COVID case is predominantly coming from the users who have not used this slur before. And this is a troubling finding because as a back of the envelope calculation, these increase among the first-time users is about 2,000 Twitter users. So 2,000 Twitter users start to use this racial slur or to start to harbor the racial animus after the first case in their local area, which can potentially expose their 4 million Twitter followers to this racially charged content. And because of this pattern, it could create a multiplier effect down the road on racial animus to make this racial animus very long-lasting and widespread. Well, so far, we've known that COVID-19 pandemic indeed sparked racial animus in the local area. So we want to know why. Why would the pandemic make people have more racial animus? So here we propose 3 different potential factors. So the first is just the fear of infectious disease. As we've seen in the previous talks in this conference, there is correlation between local area fear and also the severity of the pandemic. So indeed, people are fear of the pandemic. So maybe that's why they start to harboring this racial animus against the Asian. And the second factor could be the purported connection between COVID-19 and the Asian population. So the reason we say that is because we could also look at racial animus against other minorities in the US using racial slurs against the other minorities, for example, Hispanics, Jewish, and Black Americans. But what we found is that across the board, either in Google or Twitter, we don't see a change in racist searches or racist tweets regarding the other minorities. So the racial animus increase is indeed targeted only at Asians, not at other minorities. And the second finding to support the connection as an important factor is that we could try to see how would the racial animus respond during the period of time when this purported connection is very salient. So we proxy the salience of this purported connection using the number of President Trump's tweets about both China and COVID at the same time. So basically, this table is telling you that on the days when President Trump tweets more about China and COVID in the same tweets, we see higher racial animus across the United States. And importantly, these national racial animus is not responding to President Trump's tweets only about China or only about COVID. It only responds to the tweets when it's mentioning both China and COVID at the same time. And finally, the third potential factor that could mediating the effect of COVID-19 on racial animus is the economic downturn. So past literatures have shown that deteriorations of economic situation could spark racial animus against African Americans. So it could be the case in our case, in the current situation too. But what we found is that it's actually not the case, because we could partition the areas by whether they are more susceptibility to negative economic impact of COVID versus not. And as we can see, the blue lines, the areas that are susceptible to higher impact versus the red line that's susceptible to lower impact, their response is very similar, at least to the initial rise in racial animus. So it seems that economic downturn is not a huge driver for the initial rise in racial animus. And one reason could be that at the beginning of this pandemic, the negative impact is just not well understood among the residents. So just to conclude, in this paper, we find that the COVID-19 pandemic indeed spurs racial animus against Asians in the US. And this could have potential dire impact down the road, as we documented a correlation between anti-Asian hate crimes and racial animus, as well as the revenue or the visits to Chinese restaurants or Asian-owned business with the racial animus. And given our findings, some potential ways to curb racial animus would be to educate the public about the dissemination of the disease and to delink any purported connection between a disease and a racial group. So if you have any comments and questions, feel free to reach out at this email address, and you can also find our paper on this website. And thank you all again for organizing this wonderful conference.
Thank you very much, Runjing, for this really interesting talk. I think the findings you present are very compelling and very disturbing at the same time, of course. there's been some comments commenting on how good a data collection method you have come up with, combining Google and Twitter together. I agree, it's really innovative and a very good way to capture the public opinion in two different spheres. One question that occurred to me, just that you briefly mentioned on your conclusion slide as well, is about the potential long-term impact of this kind of thing. So in your graphs, it struck me that there was a very peak spike in racial slur use with the first case occurrence. Right. However, that spike was decreasing fairly quickly as well, and then was going back to almost pre-spike levels in about 4 weeks' time. So right. I think that's a very interesting pattern, especially combined with the previous talk about this turmoil that people are feeling about their identity and trust to the government and so on. What would you say about the role of other actors in the society in terms of making sure that the effect goes away fully in 4 weeks versus stays with us in the long term?
Yeah, so first, so for Twitter data, we indeed see that there's a spike right after the first case, but then it goes down. But for the Google searches, the effect is more persistent there. So it's not very unclear on the first glance that these racial animus is going away. So because to answer this question more rigorously, we indeed need more data. Ideally, a real life measurement of racial animus, for example, hate crimes, but we don't have that. We would love to see it in the future. And the second, in terms of what are the other actors that contributing to this rise in racial animus. So one thing that's been mentioned in previous talks is the social media and also the media portrait of these events. Because when there is first case, obviously newspapers are gonna mention it, and also newspapers of different partisan line will mention it differently. So that could further fuel this racial animus, because people have been using this as a political propaganda tool, basically, in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really important work with lots of implications for policy, but also in terms of public justice, how we treat others at a personal level as well.